All right, so our warm up today is Natural Humorous Day. And so my question is, what is your favorite, and I should say school appropriate joke? Do any of you guys have any good jokes? Anybody? Ah, I love that. Do you know how to drive this thing? That is great. Oh my gosh. Love it. What about the rest of you? A Minecraft joke book? Okay, if you got any jokes, I want to hear them. I have one for you. Remember, I told you guys I like puns and dad jokes. So,
I have one.
okay, tell me.
Uh, what did the fish say when it ran into a wall? Damn.
Oh gosh, what?
Damn.
Oh, I love it. What is the best way to learn about a computer? Anybody know?
No. How?
Bit by bit.
It's funny. Yeah.
Get it? I love those. What has 10 letters and it starts with gas?
Gasoline? I don't know.
An
Oh,
automobile.
that's great. Okay.
I have a lot of those types of but-bump type of jokes. I love those things.
What's green and fuzzy, and if it fell out of a tree, it would kill you?
Oh gosh, what?
A green, fuzzy piano.
A green fuzzy piano. Oh my gosh. Yeah, I do know about the laundry pods named Gain. I'm responding to Kenneth here.
What is a bucket that's red?
I don't know what.
A blue bucket painted red.
A blue bucket painted red. What do you gain from that? The laundry pods? I don't know. Minor injuries. Cute. Who were the greenest presidents in US history? The Bushes. Greenest, yeah. The Bushes. Oh, what do you call a fish wearing a bow tie? Yes, Taj?
I got a joke.
Okay, let me finish my joke. A fish wearing a bow tie is sophisticated.
So sophisticated. That's so
So
funny.
sophisticated. Yeah. Okay, go ahead, Taj.
Okay, why did the dog do so well in school?
Why?
Because he was the teacher's pet.
Love it. Oh my gosh, I love that. Love it. What do you call a cat's favorite TV show? Claw and Order.
That's funny.
I love those types of jokes. I'm like, I told you guys when we used to watch CNN 10 and they would do the puns at the end, my kids would just laugh at me, not at the puns at the end. They would laugh at me because I was laughing so hard at the puns. So, it was a twofer. All right, guys, I need you to open up your Module 9 Lesson 3 course arc and your journal. We need to finish those up today. And then I've got a PowerPoint about some of the conflicts around the world. And these are, I'm going to just mainly, I'm just going to kind of talk about the ones that deal with Africa. So I've got a couple of them that I want to show you guys. So while you are opening up that, I am going to go. Okay, so remember I showed you guys the Horn of Africa in our thing. So Ethiopia and then the newly created country of Eritrea were in that Horn of Africa. They were both Italian colonies. Post World War II, Ethiopia was given independence and they were given control over Eritrea. So they get a hold of it, they ban their local language, they dissolve the Eritrean legislature, and literally for 30 years, Eritrea fought Ethiopia for their independence. So you have colonization, and then you have, again, going back to that kind of tribal warfare, because you have the people of Ethiopia controlling the people of Eritrea, two different groups, two different languages, etc. So 1991, Eritrea defeats the Ethiopian army. 1993, they gain their independence. 1998, again, another border dispute between the two countries and violence restarts. And in 2000, Ethiopia ends up winning the disputed area. So this is the area on the map. So if you look at this, it'll give you an idea. It's not just language, it's also religious. Okay, so you look at the kind of bluish gray, that is predominantly Muslim. And you look at kind of the orangey color, that is predominantly Christian. And by the way, guys, we're talking about Aramaic and Coptic Christians versus Muslims versus Eastern Orthodox Christians. Okay. And then you have these little areas. Do you see where it looks like IR? These little like spots here. Those are indigenous religions. Okay. So Eritrea, 9 ethnic groups split between Muslim and Christians remain largely united because of their fight against Ethiopia. Okay, this is Eritrea, right? And then this is Ethiopia. Oh, and then there you go. Here's one of my favorite geography jokes. Did you hear about Ethiopia? They're so dumb, they couldn't even find Djibouti with both hands on their atlas. There you go. Last one. All right. North and South geography of Sudan. Remember, that was one of the things that we had talked about, especially when we were talking about Darfur and Black Hawk Down yesterday. So Northern Sudan has Arabs, Muslims. They're predominantly urbanized, so a lot of cities. They have ties to Egypt, very dry area. South Sudan, the people there are not Arabic. They're African, they're Black. Christians and animists, meaning Christians and like tribal belief systems. They are farmers, so mostly they are, agriculture versus urban. They have ties to Chad, Uganda, and Kenya, and South Sudan is very tropical with lush rainforests. Okay, so I mean, as opposite as you can possibly get. So large. Oh, I'm just glad you're here, Gabriel. A large, poor, about 40 million people. They gained their independence in 1956 from Great Britain. So from 56 to 72, civil wars, northern and southern, were like warring over control over the central government. 1984 to 2005, their central government, which was Arab Muslim dominated, tried to assert power over the South, which was Black Christians and animists. They imposed Sharia law. Remember, that is the belief system that everything that is written in the Quran, you follow it very heavily. Okay. There was a discovery of oil, as you can imagine. Huge now battle, right? Over 2+ million people died, 5% of their population, and over 1 million people became refugees. The Accord of 2005 called for autonomy in the South and power sharing in the national government. So today, this is Sudan today and Darfur. So Sudan's government is the NIF, which is the National Islamic Front. Their capital is in Khartoum. Darfur is a region in Western Sudan. Opposition groups in Darfur rose up against the NIF. The government crushed their rebellion. So you're like northern, southern, and then Darfur. So is it genocide, right? Sudan's government supporting an Arab militia known as the Janjaweed, looting and burning villages, bombing of villages, rapes and murders. Basically, 1.6 million became homeless, over 70,000 dead. So the big discussion has been, is this genocide? And most people say, yes, you're actually targeting a group of people and you are killing them off. That meets the actual definition of genocide. So the people of Darfur need humanitarian assistance. It's very difficult for this to happen, though, because the area is very hard to reach and it is exceedingly dangerous. Any peacekeepers, any groups that go in there to help usually end up getting targeted and terrorized or killed. You know, the United Nations trying to demand that they disarm the Janjaweed. You have the US going, hey, genocide is taking place. The African Union, which is a union of African countries in sub-Saharan Africa, sending troops there, but there's not enough of them. They've been asking for a lot of UN peacekeepers. The Sudan, though, says this would be an occupation, not helpful. So as you can imagine, it's not been very helpful. Somalia, we've talked about, you know, there's Eritrea and Ethiopia. Well, then you have Somalia in here. Seems unified on the surface. They're Sunni Muslim, Somali speaking, that's the language. Their government has collapsed. In 1992, they had over 300,000 die from famine and war. Peace talks collapse in 1994. United States withdraws their troops. So yeah, we'll come back to the rest of this when we hit the Middle East. But those were just the ones we had talked about in our course arc and our notes. So I kind of wanted to give you like some visuals for that. And hopefully I've given you guys enough time to open this up. So we need to do did we do this part of the Google Maps yesterday? I don't think we had gotten to this, had we? No? Okay. So, along with Tanzania, the location of Al Qaeda bombings in 1998. I'm asking you to remember from stuff yesterday. Can anybody tell me which one had Al Qaeda bombings? Is it Nairobi, South Sudan, North Africa, Suez Canal? Nairobi, good. Nationalization caused war to break out between Egypt and Britain, France, and Israel. South Sudan, North Africa, or Suez Canal? The Suez Canal, good. Location of fighting during World War II in order to attach German-held lands? North Africa, which then leaves us with South Sudan. So I'm going to give everybody a chance. Make sure you have that in there. Did anybody come up with anything else to add to our Google Maps writing on the journal? Because we had South Sudan. In South Sudan, there was a massive civil war and accusations of ethnic cleansing taking place. I mean, we would say what? What can we say about Nairobi? Can anybody give me anything? What was Nairobi? Nairobi had to do with the bombing of what? I know I'm asking you guys to go back. Remember, all you have to do is click on the Google Maps. And remember, it takes you to the thing. So what can we say about Nairobi in our Google Maps on our journal? Does anybody have anything? Because I'm waiting for you guys to give me the information. I'm not going to give you the answer to this. Anybody? Guys, I mean, we're going to just sit here and stare at each other because I'm not giving you guys answers. So, okay, so we can add in Nairobi, who would we say bombed the U.S. embassies? Right? Terrorists associated with Al Qaeda? Okay. So then we could say Nairobi discussed the bombings of American embassy by terrorists associated with Al Qaeda and Osama bin Laden, right? We got to add that in there. And of course, also the American response, right? Because their response was to bomb them back. Okay. Although it says terrorists, that should probably say terrorists with an S, right? Okay. What about the Suez Canal? What can we say about the Suez Canal? What can we say about that? Well, not their land. What land? That's too generic, Taj. We need to be a little bit more specific, right? So we talk about it's had a very contentious, right, history. Because here's the deal, guys. Great Britain is the one who actually financed and build the Suez Canal. You're being still too generic, right? Their resources there is too generic, okay? We're talking about the Suez Canal. So you need to be very specific in how you're talking about this, right? So Suez Canal in Egypt has had a very contentious history with Britain building it and numerous countries wanting to control this strategic waterway because it is a strategic waterway, right? It's what connects the Mediterranean over to the Indian Ocean. Especially after Egypt's Nasser nationalized the canal, right? He was like, nope, it's ours. And everybody went, whoa, 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 whoa. What do you mean it's yours? Right? Okay, what can we say about North Africa? Let's go back. North Africa. What can we say about that? Come on, guys. I need somebody else to give me something with this. Taj is being great and throwing stuff in there. Savannah threw some stuff in there. But I need the rest of you guys to give me some information. What resources and land, though, Annalisa? You've got to be specific, right? So Great Britain and France, because we're not talking about just generic here. We're being specific about what was in the Google map. Okay. So Great Britain and France's feuding spilled over into control over the Suez Canal. But here's the thing. Great Britain and France weren't fighting each other. They actually were united in fighting against Nasser when he nationalized the Suez Canal. prior to that, Great Britain and France, had this long history of fighting each other. But when it comes to the Suez Canal, they actually were fighting Egypt, right? So think about how you want to word that, because you need to specify. We're talking about the Suez Canal, okay? What can we say about North Africa? This one is more about what? What is North Africa more about? Okay, so North Africa was a German-held territory during World War II. Okay, so what else about it? What about this? Like, why is this in this Google map for this particular lesson? But that's a good start, Taj. So what was going on in this area? So we have that North Africa was a German-held territory during World War II. There needs to be more, right? How does this relate to the topic of the lesson? Anybody think of it? I mean, we're talking about the Allies, right? Because they're against Germany. So what can we say about that? Come on, guys. I need a few of you guys to throw some stuff out here instead of just waiting. What were the Allies doing? Germany's holding Northern Africa. So what are the Allies doing? Which landing? There were numerous landings. You got to be specific, right? Let's see if I can get this too. See if I can show you this. All right. So this was considered French North Africa. Okay. When they're talking about French North Africa and sweeping across Algeria, Libya, Egypt. This is the area that they are talking about. Okay. So they land over here, they shove the Germans out of Morocco, and then they are moving their way eastward, trying to get rid of the rest of them, right? So if we're talking about German held territory during World War II, the Allies' response to that, right, in their work to free all of these areas from German control. And actually Libya was controlled by Italy, but they would be the Axis, right? So think about how you want to add that in there. Now, how do we combine all of these together? How do we discuss all of these? Because remember, on there it says, how do all these points relate to the topic of the lesson? What do they have in common? So how do we relate them together? We talk about all of the places, spoke about conflicts both within the country and with other countries outside the country's borders. They all dealt with natural resources and the controlling of them, as well as ideological differences. Okay. But it's not just control over resources, guys. Remember that the wanting of those resources led to the conflict. Remember, this whole lesson is about conflict. You have to talk about the conflict, right? Okay. They had conflicts with, so we would talk about conflicts within and conflicts with other countries, right? We definitely want to add that in there. So make sure you add that in there. Okay. All right, give me a thumbs up if you have finished typing your Google Meet or Google Map tour section in your journal. You see, Savannah's got hers done. Jennifer has hers done. Okay. Well, in Northern Africa, definitely Germans and Britain. Um, but in the other portions of Africa, we're also talking about with the Americans because of terrorist activities, right? All right, so let's move on, I think, to our writing activity. So it says, as we have seen, many conflicts in Africa are rooted in tribal issues that have never truly been resolved. The following video will provide a brief overview of some of the current issues plaguing Africa. Now, remember, guys, a lot of you guys are talking and making comments like Africa as like if it were a country. Remember, Africa is a continent with 54 countries in it. Okay. Should the international community get involved more? Would it be better or worse for those countries in Africa? And then explain. So I'm going to mute myself and I'm going to play the video and then we're going to come back, okay?
From Angola to Zimbabwe, dozens of sub-Saharan African states have been embroiled in violent conflicts since 1980. All this while African Union and United Nations forces are there on the continent working to prevent that exact thing from happening. So why can't they do more? I talked about that and other issues with Adate Akwe. He's the managing director for government relations at Amnesty International.
It's, I think we have a lot of different expectations of both the African Union and the United Nations. Some may be not realistic. I remember seeing a very interesting quote that the United Nations was created not to create heaven, but to prevent us from slipping into hell. And I actually think that that's probably something people need to remember, that both the AU and the UN are driven by member states. In other words, they can only be as functional and as forceful as their member states allow them to be. Have there been conflicts in Africa where the UN and the AU have not been as effective? Absolutely. But there's also the argument that were they not there, would we not have seen more Rwandas? Would we not have seen more Sudans? Would we not have had more Somalias? And so, one could come down on either side of the argument.
Let's talk a little bit about European colonialism. David Lamb, who covered the continent for the LA Times, wrote a great book, and in it he had a lot of vignettes. One of them was about how he had hired somebody to do the yard work, and then he hired somebody to do the inside work, cooking the food for him, and they didn't meet, and then finally they did meet, and he realized that they hated each other and they hated him, and he didn't quite get why, and he went and asked somebody, and they said, well, did you ask what tribes these people are from? And it kind of cast things, and the reason he wrote the story is that there's a Western perspective on all of this. We look at Angola, we look at Ghana, we look at Uganda, but perhaps the people who live on the continent don't see it the same way.
Well, I think it's important to remember that most of these African countries have only become independent in the late 1960s, beginning with Ghana in 1957. And so the consolidation of a national identity is very new. It's still happening. And there are indeed ongoing intrinsic loyalties to one's neighborhood and one's group, so to speak, which probably never actually go away completely, but with the right kind of government and the right kind of inclusion can be ameliorated.
One final question. The World Policy Institute estimates that $1.5 billion worth of weapons have been funneled into Africa by the United States. I see you nodding your head. This is not new to you. China, for its part, has been accused of ignoring human rights while doing business on the continent. Should more be done by the international community? And we see a lot of the negatives. What do you see from a positive standpoint coming from the continent?
Well, we have a very important opportunity with the UN adoption of an arms trade treaty. That happened last year in April. And both the major powers as well as the General Assembly members all need to move very quickly to ratify and get this treaty, which would halt or slow down the transfer of weapons, conventional arms or small and weapons, from being sent to places where they could be used in the abuse of human rights or commit mass atrocities. And that's what's really been a major driver of conflict in Africa. If we can actually get all of the African countries to sign and to ratify, and if we can finally get the United States as a role model for the rest of the permanent members of the Security Council, then I think we really do have a chance to cut down on the flow of weapons, which is, I think at one point we were estimating that it was killing about 1,500 people each year, you know, which is staggering over the period of time, and that's just beyond, you know, not counting the damage to development, the damage to infrastructure, which is a terrible challenge for Africa.
Yeah, it's hard to take a step forward when you're dealing with that. Adate Akwe, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
All right, so the journal entry says, should the international community get involved more in Africa? Do you think this would help or hurt Africa? Explain your response. So you need to do 5 to 8 sentences explaining whether or not the international community should get more involved with the countries in Africa, and then why or why not. How do you think this would affect the countries in Africa, and explain. You can't just put, I think they should, or I think they shouldn't, and just leave it at that. You need to actually explain what you mean. So that's what you guys are doing right now with me while you are sitting in our meet. And I'm right here to help you out with that. So that's what we are doing right now. You guys are finishing your journal right now so that you can turn it in. And then I see some of you guys turned in course arcs and you were absolutely okay with not even making minimum Fs on them. I'm so confused. Make sure you fix those. I've had a couple of you guys already turn in your journal, and I have graded them. So go back and look at your grade on there. Some of you guys need to go back. I think a couple of you did not even answer the written response, so you did not get full credit. Obviously, you need to finish that. So go back and look if you have submitted your journal already to see what you got on that. Let's see. I'm looking for maybe another short video that might help. I'm looking. There's a lot of stuff about how China is getting involved in Africa and Russia. But I'm looking for something like more more recent. I mean, this is a little bit longer video, but at least it might give you guys some thoughts.
PayPal works with the tools you already use, like BigCommerce, Whoop.
Hi, I'm Steve Clements, and I have a question. How does the United States get Africa so wrong? And why are other powers like China and Russia and Turkey making more headway on the continent? Let's get to the bottom line. No one can blame Africans for assuming that the rest of the world has very little interest in their continent, except maybe for extracting natural resources like gold and oil, or buying weapons and counterterrorism. Former U.S. President George W. Bush famously referred to it as a nation instead of a continent with 54 very diverse countries, each with its own unique interests and history. President Trump had awful things to say about Africa, and we're not going to repeat them here. The West simply hasn't updated its views on Africa for centuries. Either it's a place for global competition between the great powers, or it's in need of Christian evangelism, or it needs help with food and medicine. There's an enormous gap between the realities of Africa's dynamism and its diversity, its entrepreneurship, that make the nations of Africa, many of them, some of the most fascinating places in the world. So is the United States missing out on the reality of Africa today? Who's getting it right, and who's filling that vacuum? Today, we're talking with Zainab Usman, Senior Fellow and Director of the Africa Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and previously at the World Bank, and Yinka Adegoke, a veteran journalist who's been covering innovation in Africa for a long time for Reuters, Quartz, and more recently Semaphore, where he is the Africa editor, and I'm also editor-at-large, so he's a colleague. Zainab, let me start with you and just ask, how outdated is America's conception and engagement with Africa as a continent?
The perceptions of Africa and the US are very much outdated, and I would say that they are stuck in the 20th century for the most part. You find this across various levels of American society. So overall, Africa is seen as a humanitarian case racked by conflict, by corruption, by terrorism, and in need of aid, as you mentioned in your introduction. All of these things are true. The problem is that they are incomplete. They present an incomplete picture of where African countries are today. So within the American government, things are starting to shift, but overall, Africa is seen as a humanitarian backwater that is not central to US strategic priorities, as you have in the case of Europe. You can see with the war in Ukraine, all of the billions of dollars that Ukraine and even other European countries have received, or the case of parts of Asia. So Africa is not seen as core to US strategic priorities. President Biden has not visited Africa since he assumed office over a year ago, although he has visited Europe, he has visited the Middle East. We saw the trip to Saudi Arabia, right? President Trump never visited Africa and called Africa, used very colorful language to describe Africa.
I mean, just want to say he used abhorrent language to describe Africa.
Abhorrent language, absolutely. Yeah. At the level of economic engagement, investments, and trade, we're also seeing that the numbers are really declining precipitously. Take trade, for example. Trade between the United States and African countries has actually declined from around $160 billion in 2008 to just around $64 billion today. And most of that is actually, when you disaggregate it, it's mostly, it involves oil and gas, extractive industries. It's not really trade in substantial things that can really transform African economies, unlike what you have in China, with the case of China. So trade between China and African countries reached a historic high of over $250 billion in 2021 last year. And then finally, all of this is tied up with, I would say, media narratives on Africa in the United States, which are still very much dated. Again, this perception that Africa is racked by conflict, it's a humanitarian crisis, all of those things. And unfortunately, I think they affect how ordinary Americans see Africa. You have a lot of reluctance from many people to engage with a part of the world that they feel is very, very problematic.
But when we come to the issues, Yinka, of talking about, Africa and what is happening there, I think part of the question is, why are China, Turkey, even Russia getting that story and Americans are not?
To your point about dynamism, it is also the place with the world's youngest population, and it's often, even that sometimes is portrayed as a problem, as a disadvantage. But actually, the world will be relying on African workers in the next 30 to 40 years, because it is the only continent actually producing people who will be the future of humanity, really, in terms of young workers. But also, if you look at it today, there's a fast-growing tech hubs across the continent, which are some of the one place in the world where the slowdown in tech investment hasn't happened. More companies are coming out of there, and often even that story is told as African companies doing stuff for African people. But actually, increasingly, because of this same issue about young tech workers and where talent is, what the internet has done is it's opened up the world. So even the young tech workers are beginning to be the tech workers for massive companies like Google and Microsoft are on the continent.
Zainab, if I were to kind of look at the ingredients, if I wanted to kind of recreate what happened with, say, the Asian tigers, the tiger economies that grew so quickly and fast. Part of it is having a big population. Part of it is having human capital that's there. You've got 1.2 billion people. As I've learned from your article, I should tell people you can read Zainab's work in Foreign Affairs recently, how America can foster an African boom. But you document in here that here you've got 1.2 billion people, greater investment in human capital, a very young audience. Tomorrow's future global middle class, a big chunk of it will be in Africa. And so I guess my question is, what needs to happen by way of the social contract in some side of some of these African nations to fuel some of what Yinka was just referring to, the economic dynamism? And, is there a space for someone like America to be part of it? And I guess my other part of it, does it matter if we're part of it?
Yes, a very, very crucial questions. I think I'm going to build on what Yinka said about Africa's population and also, I guess, Africa's fundamentals. Those fundamentals, whether it's the demographics, whether it's the economic structure of African countries, they present both opportunities and challenges. Unfortunately, the narratives today overemphasize on the challenges, right? So yes, there's conflict, yes, there's violence in certain parts of the continent, but actually when you look at certain analyses that have been done by, whether it's entities like Statista and others, the world's most violent cities, the top 10, only one is in Africa, Cape Town. All of the other cities are in Latin America, in Brazil, in Mexico, et cetera, right? So it's just that the challenges in Africa are overemphasized. And the fundamentals today present opportunities. And what are those opportunities? So let's take demographics, for example. The continent has the world's fastest growing population, and it's also the world's youngest. Median age in Africa today is around 19, compared to around 30 in the Middle East and in South Asia, in Asia, compared to around 38 in the US and in China, and also very importantly compared to, I think, 44 or 45 in Europe. So Africa is a young continent, and it's growing. It's going to be the continent with the world's future labor force. So already, you know, if you want to think constructively,
future labor force and future buyers,
future buyers, future consumers, and we've seen already entities from China have made a lot of headway on this front because they've seen that potential. So mobile phone companies like Transsion became global market leaders today because of their investments in Africa. Whereas companies from other parts of the world in the early 2000s felt that Africans were too poor to afford mobile phones. And there are examples like that across the board. So the challenges today, when you look at it and you invest there and you create opportunities for all these young people, become opportunities for companies in the future, right? So I think it's a matter of a mindset shift. And then to the last part of your question, is there a role for the US? There is, of course, a huge role for the US to play. You look at the comparative advantage of the US, the way I would frame it anyways, in terms of private capital. This is the world's largest market economy. African countries need investments, right? It's actually a dearth of investments, especially around infrastructure in the early 2000s, that made a lot of African countries turn to China because they were not getting the investments from Western bilateral lenders or even from the World Bank and other multilateral lenders. They turned to China. Those investment needs are still there. The continent needs about $150 billion every year for infrastructure investments. The continent, again, needs around $50 billion for climate adaptation, right? To be able to invest in, climate-resistant agriculture, crops, buildings, bridges, etc. Those are all things that the U.S. can help with. Digital technologies, we have Silicon Valley. If companies want to expand to new markets today and in the future, Africa is the place. So there are so many examples like these that I can bring, that there's so much that can be done. The U.S. has a role to play, but the mindset has to shift to see Africa not just as a continent of problems, but a continent where when you think innovatively of addressing those problems, you come up with solutions that work for Africans, but that also work for the investor and the partner country.
Right. Well, let me ask you, Yinka, there are companies like Qualcomm and Microsoft and MasterCard that I happen to personally know are investing and building teams to approach the African.
Guys, the writing prompt question is actually asking you about today, not about past wars, not about just South Africa, today. You need to answer that based on today. Some of you guys are not, so you're not getting points for your writing prompt, okay? And somebody just put something about South of America. Yeah, has nothing to do with what we just talked about. And somebody put positives, and yeah, you didn't even answer the question. Totally minimum F. Guys, I go over what you should be answering. We talk about it, and then you guys turn in stuff that don't answer. So minimum Fs are going out. All right, guys, we've got about 3 minutes left in class, okay? So as a reminder, Module 9, Lesson 2, the course arc and the journal will close today. Remember, your journal is a summative. You want to get that turned in. Your Module 9 Lesson 3 that we've been working on, Course Arc and Journal. Your Course Arc you should have turned in because we completed that in class. Your journal, as soon as you finish, you need to turn that in. That is due today. And then don't forget our small group meets on Friday morning if you have any questions. And I think that is it. We are done for the day.